Hi, good day and welcome to this session on the relationship spectrum. By the end of this session, you should be able to list the various types of relationships and their characteristics, and then understand the pros and cons of adopting a particular relationship style. The relationship spectrum basically depicts the various types of relationships that a business can adopt depending on the level of closeness between parties. And then this is a typical relationship spectrum which spans from adversarial to co-destiny. And each type of relationship to be adopted depends on the level of quality of interaction, the trust between the parties, the openness between the parties, the level of commitment that is required by the parties, the duration, the risk assessment, and the risk management between both parties. That's whether the buyer and the supplier or buyer and customer. So we'll take each of the relationships in the spectrum and then discuss them in the subsequent sections. So when we take adversarial relationships, they are characterized by little trust and communication. There is no potential for future transactions because the buyer doesn't see the need to commit to the relationship with the buyer and with the supplier. And then the arm's length relationships, as the name implies, it is an interaction which is of an arm's length in nature, short, impersonal, and there are infrequent purchases characterized by low volume or low value. And then we move on to the transactional relationships where there is sort of regular dealings, but the buyer has multiple choices to choose from or to select their supplies. Hence, there is no little or no commitment between the buyer and the supplier in this case. Then we move to closer tactical. Buyer wants to secure quality and continuity of supply in addition to cost efficiency. So they seek to foster a degree of mutual commitment and collaboration in an ongoing relationship with few reliable suppliers. Then we move to single source relationships where the buyer decides to deal with just a single supplier in order to secure continuity and quality. Then we move on to outsourcing relationship where the buyer seeks to acquire goods and services from an external service provider so as to be able to so as for the buyer to be able to focus on their internal core competencies. And then move on to strategic alliance where buyer and supplier collaborate strategically to deliver a product or a joint offering. And then we have partnership where their buyer and supplier agree to collaborate closely for a longer term, thereby sharing information and ideas for development. Then we have co-destiny relationship where the buyer and supplier develop closer relationships strategically for both their benefits. Then we move on to another means of classifying relationships, which is by Cox in their step ladder of contractual relationships, which range from short-term adversarial to long-term strategic collaboration. So the first one in their relationships is the adversarial leverage, where there is multi-sourcing. Buyer can decide on whoever they want to buy from. And then we move on to preferred suppliers, where buyers determine reliable few suppliers that they want to deal with, and then they decide to buy from them. And then it moves on to single sourcing, where they decide on a specific supplier who is high quality and advanced and has distinctive competence in what they require. Then moving to the network sourcing and partnerships between the buyer and a first-tier supplier who facilitates relationships with second-tier suppliers. Then move on to strategic supplier or joint venture where buyers and suppliers come together to complement each other and then come out with a new business offering for both their benefits. Then another relationship spectrum is by McMoore, who offers approaches or purchasing approaches depending on the nature of relationships that exist between buyers and suppliers. So we have spot buying, which is characterized by making one-off purchases to meet requirements as and when they arise. So this is characterized by adversarial type of relationships where there is disregard of the level of interaction that exists between parties. Then we move on to regular trading, which is the process of giving repeat business to a group of preferred or trusted known suppliers, and is characterized by some degree of collaboration. Then we have call of contract, framework agreements, or blanket ordering, where there is an established agreed terms of trade, and then orders are given as and when they are required. And then we have fixed contract, which is typical of the call of contract, but orders are given or terms are given at fixed intervals for a defined period of time. Then we have alliance, which is short-term agreement to work together with the supplier for mutual advantage. Then we have the strategic alliance, which is more of which is more of long-term in nature, to agree in to strategically work together and then develop in a given area. And it can be seen in systems integration, joint new product development, among others. Then we have partnership, which is also long-term in nature, but buyers work together on a range of issues for joint advantage. Then we move on to factors which determine the type of relationship to adopt. So there is no single relationship that is best, but the type of relationship, depending on the spectrum, is determined by several factors, and one of them is the type and length of the supply contract. So whether you are adopting a transaction approach or not, the nature of or the length of supply contracts has to be considered. Then the number of suppliers in the market has to also be considered in determining the right relationship to adopt, because in the end one may gain power over the other and might want to exploit the other party. Then the product or service to be provided is also another factor which determines the kind of relationship to be provided and to be adopted, and that can be seen typically in the Kraujik matrix. And then the amount and quality of information in exchange also determines the kind of relationship to adopt, because if one is not willing to exchange information, there wouldn't be a need to adopt a collaborative relationship. Then the pricing scheme and delivery schedule. So if you want a fixed price contract, that determines what type of relationship you are adopting. Then the extent of senior management involvement. We all know that senior management involve themselves in ventures that are strategic and important to the entire organization. So if you are in a relationship and you realize that there is little or no level of senior management involvement, then you know that probably a transaction or a leveraging approach is best for the relationship instead of a collaborative approach. Then we move on to multiple sourcing relationships, where you have more than one source of supply for your goods and services, and they have several advantages because they help you to manage risk. In essence, your offerings or requirements are spread among multiple suppliers, and you have several sources of supply for your risk. Hence, if one source fails, there is little or no risk incurred or little or no loss incurred. It also avoids risk of incompatibility. For instance, if you decide in the situation in single sourcing where you decide to just focus your relationship on a single supplier might fail when you have incompatible systems and processes in place. But this is an advantage in multiple sourcing, because in the end you don't have a single obligation towards a single supplier. It helps you to take advantage of the best possible price, because you have several suppliers in the market. You tend to have the option of switching and then buying from whomever you please, depending on the price, because in such arrangement it is characterized by lowest possible price. It enables flexibility and access to quality. However, there are certain disadvantages of the multiple sourcing. It leads to unnecessarily high procurement costs, because in essence you are dividing your orders among the numerous number of suppliers in the market. It might lead to waste, because in essence you are retaining suppliers who might no longer meet the firm's requirement, and then it fails to enable the firm to exploit the value adding and competitive potential of focusing on collaborative relationships with just a few suppliers. Then we move on to single sourcing arrangement. This is where you focus your relationship and your resources and your efforts on just a single supplier, and it is suitable for supplier commitment and co-investment. It is suitable for when you want preferential treatment, especially on price. It's also suitable to minimize supply risk. It's appropriate when the total requirement is too small to justify splitting orders among several suppliers. It's also suitable when one supplier is far ahead of others in terms of reputation, quality, and other things that would put the organization on the competitive edge. It is also suitable when there are expensive setup costs to enable supply, which would not warrant the need to deal with multiple suppliers. And then it's also suitable when requirements are subject to supply risk, hence dealing with one supplier who will assure supply is essential. Adversarial or competitive relationships are characterized by lack of trust and little information sharing, one-off or short-term transaction focus. There is little cooperation or recognition of mutual interest in adversarial relationships. It is a rigorously enforced compliance with contract terms because one party has leverage over the other and they exercise their effort to exploit the other party who has no power. And then it's characterized by use of power and negotiation to seek the best possible deal. Cooperative or collaborative relationships are characterized by maximizing gains for both parties, thereby enhancing sharing and collaboration as well as synergy. So collaborative relationships are characterized by maximizing gains such that 2 plus 2 is never 4 but 5. In such an instance, both parties work together to maximize value from each party's contribution, thereby adding an extra value to the contribution, which signifies the 2 plus 2 being equal to 5. Buyer and supplier share common interests in collaborative relationships because in essence you are working to complement each other on your shortcomings and not exploiting one's weaknesses to gain at their expense. Cooperative or collaborative relationships are characterized by joint and mutual search for greater efficiency and effectiveness. It's also characterized by joint planning for future by the buyer and supplier, as well as agreed shared objectives, openness and transparency, relationships of being of equal partners, and there's no master servant attitude since there is no leverage or exploitation, and both realize that the relationships might not last forever, and both parties come together to jointly agree of an exit strategy, which leads to little or no conflict when the relationship comes to an end. Then we move on to the distinction between outsourcing and subcontracting. Outsourcing is basically providing to or requesting an outside service provider to provide a service which used to be previously provided in-house so that the organization can focus on its core competence. And outsourcing is more of a long-term strategic approach. However, subcontracting is just about the organization giving part of an entire project that they are required to provide to an external third-party provider. So the distinction between outsourcing and subcontracting is that outsourcing is characterized by giving an on-call activity which was previously provided in-house to a third-party provider, but subcontracting is characterized by giving part of an overall project to a third-party provider to provide for you. Outsourcing is more of long-term strategic in nature, but subcontracting is short-term tactical approach. Management issues in outsourcing and subcontracting. The decision to outsource or subcontract should be based on clear objective and measurable benefit. So whether you are outsourcing or not, you have to decide on the cost and benefit analysis, whether it's going to be disadvantageous or advantageous to the firm. And it should also be based on clear and agreed service levels. What are you expected to achieve at the end of the service provided by the third party? It should also be based on rigorous supplier selection, given the long-term partnership nature of the outsourced relationship. So you don't just wake up and give your outsourcing contracts to just any supplier, but you should ensure that whoever you are giving the outsourced contract to can provide to their highest competence and they have the capability to deliver efficiently and effectively. The advantages and disadvantages of outsourcing. Outsourcing has the advantage of supporting organizational rationalization and downsizing, thereby reducing cost of staffing and space facilities. But however, the downside of outsourcing is that it has potentially higher cost of services, contracting and management compared with cost of in-house provision. An advantage of outsourcing is that it adds competitive performance incentive where internal service providers may be complacent. However, the downside is that it adds distance from the customer by having an intermediary service provider. Another advantage is that it enables access to economies of scale given the rigorous supplier selection process, which ensures that the best supplier is selected for the process. However, a downside is that there is the potential to lose control over areas of performance because the external service provider comes in with their own management and with their own bureaucracies, which might impede on the focal firm's activities. An advantage is also that enables access to specialist expertise, technologies, and resources. However, a downside is that it might lead to potential loss of expertise because the firm might lose sight of how they used to previously provide those services in-house. And in deciding on what to outsource, it should be based on activities for which external contractors have the competence or capability. It should also be applied to activities which offer value for money because in essence, money or resources will be committed. It should be applied to non-core competencies which, if outsourced, will enable the firm to leverage on its core competencies, and also competencies which will enable the firm to exploit technology or other operational capabilities which it lacks in-house. Then we move on to partnership relationships. Partnership relationships are decision by a buyer and supplier to cooperate and work together on the long term, and they are more strategic and longer in duration. They are characterized by trust and information sharing, and then they are clear. The characteristics of partnership relationships is that it commands top level management involvement. It's based on clear joint objectives, and there is commitment to long-term relationships. It is proactive. There's a proactive approach to improving the relationship, and it has high degree of systems integration because both parties work together collaboratively, sharing resources and expertise. And it's also characterized by the total quality management philosophy where everybody is involved in the delivery of quality and value to final customers. In this session, we have learned about the various types of relationships and their characteristics, as well as discussed the meaning, advantages, and disadvantages of outsourcing. Thank you.